So welcome and thanks for attending this webinar with Dr. Sophie Nakueira. My name is Julie Berg. I'm the Director of the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research, and I'll be chairing this session. And Sophie's webinar is part of a series that we are running called the Security and Justice Futures webinar series, which is jointly coordinated by the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research, the Global Risk Governance Programme at the Centre for Criminology at the University of Cape Town, Kenya's National Crime Research Centre, and the Centre for Human Rights and Policy Studies. So I'm very, very pleased to introduce Dr. Sophie Nakueira today. Sophie Nakueira at the moment is a visiting fellow at the Human Understanding of Machines and Algorithms at the University of Duisburg in Germany. Sophie is also an associate researcher at the Max Planck Institute of Social Anthropology. And so Sophie's background is diverse in terms of her disciplinary focal areas. So she's got a law background as well as criminology and anthropology. And she focuses on a range of issues, including transnational non-state governance, security governance, plural governance, vulnerable populations. And her current project is exploring the kind of impacts of AI on vulnerable populations. So her talk today will focus on these intersections between technology and vulnerability, and how tech for good can achieve unintended bad consequences in shaping refugee experiences of vulnerability. So the seminar is being recorded, and we'll also record the discussion session. But Sophie, it's up to you again whether you want people to engage with you during the presentation. But there's also opportunities for you to put your questions in the chat or to save questions at the end. But I would ask that you put your videos and put yourselves on mute while Sophie presents, unless she prompts you to engage with her in questions. So Sophie, you'll speak for about 40 minutes. And I thank you again for joining this webinar, and I'll hand over to you, Sophie.
Thank you very much for inviting me to give this webinar. I'm particularly excited to be presenting it to a diverse context of audience, and I'm happy that Professor Clifford Shering has joined, as well as you, Julie, because we've done a lot of work on some of the themes that will be recurring in this talk. And I hope that during the discussion, when you chair, you can maybe pull out some of these themes for the audience in the Global North to elaborate on how they appear in the Global South context. My talk today will focus on biometrics and emerging technologies in an African humanitarian context. I will reflect on emerging technologies and how they're shaping humanitarian governance in the Global South and what the effects are on vulnerable populations. I will situate my talk in Uganda. So although I focus on an African humanitarian context, I hope that the insights will be globally relevant. The reason for this is that new technologies are being piloted in select contexts, and then they are expanded to other regions. And the technologies that I focus on here were piloted elsewhere before they were introduced in Uganda. Refugee camps are interesting sites in which to interrogate these issues because they are sites of experimentation. As one UNHCR official explained to me, we first test them, referring to the technologies, in a few contexts. And when they are successful in those contexts, we then deploy them in all operations. Thus, we should understand refugee camps as laboratories for innovation, as Madianu has noted, and this has also been noted in other humanitarian contexts in the Global North by Molnar in her book, The Walls Have Eyes, where she looks at how new tech is used to police or to govern refugees in Greece. But the reason why this is particularly concerning is that these are vulnerable populations, and therefore testing technologies which have a risk of failure is tantamount to exacerbating the experiences of vulnerability of vulnerable populations. So we should be concerned particularly about the ethical issues that arise when we test new technologies on vulnerable populations in a humanitarian context, particularly when we look at global south contexts. These are usually very fragile spaces where refugees are constrained and their vulnerabilities intersect with resource constraints in those spaces. This research will draw on work that I conducted between 2020 and 2023 for another project. The project was called VALNA, and it focused on understanding refugees' experiences in countries of first asylum. I conducted this research in Uganda and in South Africa. But my focus will focus on Uganda. I interviewed refugees to understand their experiences, and technology is one of the things that came up when they mentioned biometric verification. I also conducted participant observations in the spaces where these technologies are implemented or deployed, and I talked to humanitarian workers who talked about the benefits of these technologies. So in that picture, that is me with an aid worker, a refugee who was interpreting when I was discussing the experiences of vulnerability with this elderly person. But before we get into the empirical aspects, I would like to give a view of the state of the art of the technologies that are being implemented elsewhere. States and asylum lobbies are globally pushing for automated technology. There are private actors who have thought of this as an opportune moment to invest in political problems by designing techno solutions for profit. Therefore, political issues are then repackaged into solutions that can be solved by technology. And this is happening in different areas with different consequences. An example is the World Food Programme that has partnered with Palantir Technologies. For those in the world of policing and defense, Palantir is known or infamous for its technologies in immigration enforcement and policing. So this raised a lot of concern where an organization, where a World Food Organization, which is meant to protect refugees, partners with a defense producing software technology company. In fact, for those who are not familiar, Palantir technologies were used to raid and conduct networks that surveilled parents from Mexico and under the Trump era, and they were then separated from their families and deported. So this technology that supported this was created by Palantir Technologies. Therefore, you can understand why people in the humanitarian sector were concerned that a tool that is used by immigration in the US is then, a company that produces tools used by immigration in the US is then partnering with WFP, the World Food Programme, in a humanitarian context. There have also been global hackathons and innovations for social good. There is a prize, for example, by the EU for affordable high technology for humanitarian aid. One of these prizes was won by humanitarian workers that came up with a solution to monitor real-time water usage in Uganda. This came about because in northern Uganda, when there was an influx of refugees from South Sudan, many trucks of water were being delivered, but it was difficult to account for how many trucks were delivered or if they were even delivered. And there were no receipts to show how much they cost. So this became very difficult to account for donor funding. This technology won the prize for the WASH segment, that is the water and sanitation and hygiene segment, and it is now being used in Uganda, Rwanda, Tanzania, Kenya, and Iraq. Increasingly, organizations, including UNHCR, the Red Cross as well, they have innovation hubs where humanitarian workers can compete for aid to come up with innovative solutions in the context where they work. So you can see that the technology enthusiasm is not just outside the humanitarian sector, but has in fact infected the humanitarian sector. And for better or good, the intentions are good, but we will see whether the effects are good as well. So how should we understand digital innovation in the aid sector? Digital innovation in humanitarianism, according to Madiano, can be partly understood as a response to ongoing demand for humanitarian reform and accountability. In fact, the most of last year, I spent it volunteering in a refugee camp, and I could see the aid organization trying to package the problems in the particular country I was in to fit the grant proposals that were being called for. Right now, if you want to get funding, most of the organizations have to show that there's a tech or digital compact in their work. So organizations that compete for funding that have tech issues or innovations will be prioritized for funding. But the question is technology the solution for complexity? For those who have worked in the Global South, particularly in the humanitarian sector, you understand that there are intersecting forms of vulnerabilities, which are not easily solved by technology. In particular, in the aid organization where I was working, the issues were dwindling funding, which was affecting the provision of basic needs. In that particular context, they wanted to raise money for sanitary pads because many of the refugees suffered from some form of incontinence, either through violence they had experienced, such as rape, or women and girls who were going through menstrual periods but could not have sanitation. But how could you package that in a tech solution? So this was very difficult to package. So while I think that technical solutions are important, they should not be standalone solutions because the contexts are more nuanced. Increasingly, we are also seeing the increase of public-private partnerships in the humanitarian field. Currently, UNHCR and Accenture have partnerships. In fact, the technologies I'll be focusing on in this talk are mainly produced by Accenture. I've given you the example of the World Food Programme and its partnership with Palantir Technologies, the company that produces software for defense and military organizations. World Food Programme also has a partnership with MasterCard Foundation because as goods are moving from material goods to digital goods, refugees are increasingly receiving cash in different operations. And Uganda is one of those countries where refugees are receiving cash. And therefore, MasterCard saw it as an opportunity to partner with World Food Programme to ensure that refugees can get cash. However, outside the Ugandan context, they have also noted that other tech companies such as Amazon, Facebook, Google, IBM, and Microsoft are partnering in the humanitarian sector. But for those who are unfamiliar with the context of Uganda, I'll just give you a little bit of statistics before we get into the nitty-gritty of the technologies and their effects. As of December 31st, 2024, Uganda is hosting 1.7 million refugees. This is because it is surrounded by countries in conflict. Uganda is the largest hosting country in Africa, and this is because of the conflicts around the region. Right now, 1 million of those refugees are from South Sudan, but we are increasingly getting refugees from Sudan as well, as the recent crisis has shown. We also have a large number from DR Congo, Somalia, Burundi, Rwanda, Eritrea, Ethiopia, and many others that produce few refugees. So on the map, you see all these blue areas where you see numbers, those are refugee settlements. And that is the population of refugees. My research was conducted in Nakueira, where the arrow is pointing, where there are 200,000 refugees. Uganda prides itself of having no encampment policy. In fact, because of its open door policy towards refugees, it is considered a refugee model country. So you may wonder, why are there refugee camps when Uganda does not have does not have an encampment policy. Uganda does not like the term refugee camps because it says it runs settlements. In Uganda, refugees can live anywhere they want to live. They're given a small piece of land on which to grow food and to build shelter. But as the numbers of refugees increase, the numbers keeps getting smaller. Refugees are allowed to work, and when they come, they're given food for at least 6 months, because they expect them to be self-reliant after 6 months. They expect them to grow their own food on the piece of land they give them. Humanitarian aid is reserved for the most vulnerable. And this is according to UNHCR criteria. So the most vulnerable are considered elderly people, people with disabilities, women at risk, and so forth. However, despite the good reputation of its open door policy, in 2018, Uganda was hit with a big scandal. It was shown to have inflated refugee figures to the tune of 300,000 ghost refugees. And when they did this, many donors were very disappointed, because earlier in 2017, they had held a global summit where they thought that the whole world should stand with Uganda and donate aid to its bulging refugee population. Consequently, after finding out that Uganda had inflated the 300,000 ghost refugees in its registry, most of the countries pulled funding, and donors demanded for better ways of monitoring aid. So this catalyzed the shift to techno solutions, with donors demanding for credible statistics and following criticisms of inefficiencies and of aid and fraud in the system. Uganda had no solution but to accept the techno solutions that were introduced. They also argued that it would allow aid agencies to target and use scarce resources better. However, I want to point out that these issues, particularly of inflating numbers, are not unique to Uganda alone. Many countries have been involved in similar scandals, and the idea is that this is countries speaking back to donors who think they can shift the burden of refugee hosting to other countries without burden sharing. The argument is that the aid that is given to many of the countries that host refugees is not enough to cater for the population. So it's only fair that these numbers are inflated. So these techno solutions have been implemented in many operations where UNHCR operates. And this is because they're tackling a systemic and global problem that is present in other fields. I will focus here on the World Food Programme and its work with MasterCard in Uganda. This was catalyzed during COVID because of border closures. It was difficult to bring aid that was given by countries like Japan. Previously, Japan used to donate rice from its country to Uganda and other operations, but you can imagine the logistical costs that are involved. So turning to digital goods was considered to be efficient because it cuts out logistics, and it gives refugees more agency. According to one aid worker that I talked to, they said that the money that they get is not conditional, and it goes directly to the refugee's account, which reduces avenues for fraud. But this is what is purported by humanitarian workers. In reality, refugees get €5 and who are very vulnerable, and those who are not very vulnerable get about €2.50 equivalent. At least that was the case at the time of doing fieldwork, but I've been told that this has been slashed. It has been critically reduced because of funding cuts. So I want to look at the diverse actors. Yes, technologies are said to improve services, but what are the other interests of the different actors that are involved? So states who host refugees are interested in refugee data because of security. They want to know who's coming into their territory. Donor states are interested in refugee data because it allows them to contain or to monitor refugee and migrant movements. UN and other agencies are interested in this data because of accountability to donors. Donors are increasingly demanding that in order for aid agencies to receive funding, they have to show impact of activities. Private tech companies, on the other hand, we should remember that while they engage in these businesses, in the sector of the humanitarian field, they're not doing so because they are benevolent actors. These are investment companies that receive a lot of funding from different investors, and therefore they're interested in the business aspect that these humanitarian fields offer. So they come up with technological fixes that can solve complex problems. However, even though all of these actors have one thing in common, their interest is in technology and data, refugee data is extracted to benefit various stakeholders. And as I've shown you, they all have competing logics. Refugees are cast in such contexts as security threats that must be contained. And this justifies the use of technology. And we've seen this as in Fortress Europe or in other areas where increasingly they want to monitor who's coming into the territory. So refugee data provides the means through which each actor achieves their own objectives. Technology is a conduit through which this can be achieved. Biometrics have been used in various operations, and so it is the default mechanism for getting refugee data. Madiano argues that this data is then outsourced to private vendors. These vendors often use large data sets, which they then use to assess needs and coordinate aid. In some contexts, artificial intelligence is used to track displaced populations and predict population movements. The collection of biometric data from asylum seekers is not new. What has changed then? Ferguson argues in his book on the rise of big data policing that what has changed is that now this data can be stored in usable and shareable databases, allowing for greater surveillance potential. I like this particular quote because even though he's noting this about big data policing in the US context, it is very applicable in the humanitarian context as well, as I will show you. I will focus on Progress V4. Progress V4 is a tool. It just means Progress version 4. It is a tool that was being introduced at the time I went to the field in 2020. I was lucky to attend a training by UNHCR. They were training the aid workers who are going to conduct refugee status determination. When I talked to one of them, she was very excited. She said, "We now know where they're coming from. In this, she was referring to the refugees. This data allows them, once they put in their fingerprints and iris scans, it allows them to show where this refugee has moved from, especially if the refugee was already registered in another country using the same system." The main tools used in Uganda are BIMS, which is Biometric Identity Management Systems, Progress version 4, and the Global Distribution Tool. When refugees come to Uganda, their iris scan is taken and fingerprints are taken at the point of registration. That refugee data is then entered into Progress version 4 and integrated with other systems. Progress is a registration tool that integrates that data with the Global Distribution Tool, and the Global Distribution Tool allows World Food Programme to provide cash, food, or core relief items in various operations. So the technologies I'm focusing on in the humanitarian context are data technologies and digital platforms that are used by UNHCR and its partners. This is a map, and this is got from UNHCR's documents. It is a map of where Progress V4 has been deployed. The green areas show where it's already active. The yellow areas show where it is pending, and you can see that there are few. And these other areas show where the training has been completed. So you can see that once all these countries that have Progress V4, if a refugee moves there, they can easily know where they are. So this is akin to having a global police in a humanitarian sector. So just to tell you a bit more about the global distribution tool, it is a web-based application which extracts data from Progress V4 based on a predefined criteria, meaning that if they're going to conduct humanitarian assistance on a particular month to a targeted population, someone can manipulate the system to bring out the particular targets and age groups and nationality, for example, who they want to give that aid. The refugee is verified at the point of distribution. So this allows for better transparency. It generates real-time statistics during and after aid distribution. It is currently being used in Uganda, but it was first piloted in Jordan to Syrian refugees. It reduces avenues for fraud and accountability. That is according to donors. But of course, with the recent scandal, which did not blow up as much, in 2022, it was reported that aid workers had found a way to collude with refugees to bypass these systems. So the benefits of these technologies are many. I do not want to focus on the negatives of them. They increase transparency to donors during aid distribution. They reduce avenues for fraud and offer accountability and oversight. With Progress, one can see who and when the system was accessed. And the GDT offers no room for discretion. And that should be a good thing, because if you cannot manipulate the system, you cannot increase or decrease people's rations. But the problem with that is, in real life, it has also negative consequences, because the aid worker cannot be flexible. One aid worker who was working at the distribution center explained to me that one time an elderly woman came to get food, but she could not carry the food. So she asked a young man to help her carry the food, and the young man disappeared with her food. So when she went back to report that the food was stolen from her, the aid worker was very sympathetic, but he couldn't do anything, because according to the system, it had already registered her as already admitted and that the food was already delivered. So in that context, where you have an elderly person whose food has been stolen from her, it didn't offer the much needed flexibility that would have been in place had it not been, had there been room for discretion. It also offers new avenues for reducing resettlement fraud and misappropriation of aid. Resettlement fraud, in my research, has been very rampant and is systemic in many countries, not just in Uganda, but elsewhere. Refugees will pay anything, those who have the means, to be included in the resettlement slots. But now, with these tools, it's very difficult to do that, because if you tamper with the system, the aid worker who tampered with it, it will show that identity. So in that way, it's a good thing, because then it reduces avenues for exploitation of refugees. However, it also has unintended consequences. This is a picture I took on a rainy day. Refugees were queuing to get cash. So they had to be verified. In a way, the GDT, that is the global distribution tool, works as a form of roll call, because it verifies the person when they come by showing a biometric fingerprint. By doing so, it impacts on freedom of movement, because if you miss verification more than 3 times, you are removed from the system. It doesn't mean that they will not put you back, but refugees do not want to deal with the violence of the bureaucratic administration. I call it violence, not because the system is violent itself, but there's a structural violence that happens when people have to wait in queues for a long time, and sometimes they have to deal with unscrupulous aid workers who may demand money or even ask them where they were during the time of distribution. So in that sense, it impacts on freedom of movement and freedom of residence, because while refugees are allowed to live anywhere in Uganda, the fact that they have to continuously go back to refugee camps to get verified, it impedes where they can work and how often they can stay away. In so doing, it disrupts employment because many of them some of them live outside the settlement, and even some of them even live outside Uganda. I found some refugees in South Africa who were registered in Uganda. And that is important because South Africa does not usually grant asylum seekers easily. It assumes that people are abusing their system. So even refugees who are in South Africa often have to come back periodically to be verified in Uganda. And for example, Somali refugees who work in Kenya will always have to come back to get verified. So in that sense, it impedes labor. It also promotes sufficiency, it promotes dependency on insufficient aid. As I explained, the money that they get is not a lot. They get about €5 at the most if they're very vulnerable, and that is for the month. So it's €5 for you to buy food or do whatever you want for that month if you're very vulnerable. If you're not vulnerable, you get about €2. So some of them who I talked to had given up. They had lost their jobs because they found that it was too expensive to spend money to come back from Kampala, the capital city, all the way to a refugee camp. The transport costs were much higher, so they just depended on insufficient aid within the camp. And in so doing, it promotes encampment. The other unintended consequences is that it is a form of smart policing and surveillance in a humanitarian context. It creates legal shadows and constitutional caps. I talk about legal shadows because on one hand, you are accounting for donor funding, but on the other hand, there are these rights that are being violated. Some people have talked about these tools as a form of colonialism because they entrench power asymmetries between refugees and aid workers, and particularly because they are produced by countries in the global north or private actors that work in the global north. It is entrenching old colonial inequalities. But I understand them as new forms of policing. They are new forms in the sense that they monitor and surveil and conduct surveillance in a different context, a context that was meant for humanitarian protection. So biometric verification of refugees during distribution is a form of surveillance, but it's not targeting just refugees. The routine audits are also targeting humanitarian workers who would otherwise abuse the system. These systems are routinely audited for irregularities. So refugee populations are monitored to see who has moved and where they have moved. As I showed you that map with where the Progress V4 has been deployed. Anyone who works in those operations that showed green can see where refugees are moving. But it also targets humanitarian fraud because it monitors the aid workers or the data users. But it raises issues that are very concerning, issues of consent. One aid worker outside Uganda who worked in Uganda before explained to me that the big monster that we are facing is what is the refugee consenting to. He explained that there is a lack of understanding of the application of the data people are giving and how it is used. And it can be used to deny asylum in other countries. And I will explain this. If a refugee has moved from Uganda, which is a country of first asylum, and they go to another country, I'll give an example of Namibia. People in Namibia who are using Progress V4 can show that this person already has asylum in Uganda. So they can use that to deny asylum. In fact, many of them have legal questions. They don't understand what do we do in this case. So while they were trained to use this system, they were not trained to answer the legal implications of seeing where the refugee has moved. Some of them end up calling the data trainers to find out what they should do in that context. But some of these people who are training them in the use of these systems are actually not lawyers. So you see that it's creating legal shadows. So one could be denied asylum based on the fact that they have an existing refugee status in another country. However, the convention, the 1951 convention that protects refugees, does not prohibit a refugee from asking asylum in another country. So these are the issues that it's raising. It also leads to something called function creep. This is an issue where a technology is used to collect data to do one thing, but can be used for another thing. And to quote this aid worker's words, he said, if you want to know information about me, and this is the criticism he has about the system himself, the humanitarian system himself. He asks, if you want to know information about me that will help you provide better assistance, you do not need to know my mother's name or my father's name. But this is the type of data we are collecting from people. We say we need this data for one thing, but then it is also used for other purposes without asking refugees. So I think this raises very serious ethical concerns that would not, that they would not be able to get away with in a European context, for example. In fact, with the Ukrainian refugees, when UNHCR collected data from them, the EU demanded that after they had used that data, they had to delete it because the function for which it had been collected had already been delivered. But no one is asking such questions in the Global South. But I do not want to show refugees as dormant or inactive people. They also exercise resistance, however limited it may be, or however unsuccessful it may be. They still exercise some form of resistance. Refugees have found a way to strategically skip verification. Some have actually decided not to register at all, meaning that they will work within the country, but some of them will not register. So the way they strategically skip verification is that they skip verification 2 times. They will miss getting this aid of €5 or €3 twice and only come the 3rd time, because it is only after the 3rd time that you will be removed from the system. Those who live outside the country come when there's verification exercise, which is less frequent. There's another form of verification, which happens every once in 3 years or once in 2 years. It's very labor intensive for the humanitarian workers. So that is the one that people who come from Kenya or South Africa come to. And the reason they come for this is because they want to remain in the system in case there are opportunities for resettlement. You cannot be resettled if you do not exist in the system. Some have resorted to looking for employment close to camps. The problem with that is that they are competing with host communities for these jobs, which are very scarce. And some of them end up working for host communities or working on the farms, but these host communities are usually people in the rural areas who are equally vulnerable, if not more vulnerable than the refugees themselves. So they end up bartering services for food. This is a form of servitude. Others just decide to move to other countries. But as I explained, these onward movements can be monitored through progress report, and thus usually they are denied status, or when they're denied status, UNHCR helps them repatriate to their countries if they want to, or others end up coming back. So we see that there's a circulation of vulnerable bodies from one country to another because refugees don't understand, in a way, how their data is being used. So the focus on data is that it prioritizes quantity over quality of humanitarian assistance. When people focus on the metrics, there's a tendency to show that there's a bigger impact than there actually is. For example, if you show that, let's say, 300,000 people turned up for food distribution, which is cash, you would think that many people are satisfied with the services. You do not think of the quality of the cash that they're getting, in that it is not enough to get a refugee through the month. The implication for refugee protection, as I explained, is that it can interfere with the refugees' right to seek asylum elsewhere because governments can see where they are coming from. Thus, refugees then are looked at as migrants. So in a way, it blurs the categories between the distinctions between asylum seeker and migrants without understanding the conditions for moving. When they see that you've moved, they don't ask you why you moved. They just see that you already have status. So in that case, then a refugee ceases to look like a refugee, but is a de facto migrant in the eyes of people who are operating these systems. So we need to view humanitarian tech in a bigger context. While I've looked at its use in a humanitarian context, this is a microcosm of the bigger picture. Ferguson argues that underneath the data and technology are people, and these are individuals living their lives. We need to do more empirical research to understand the effects of vulnerable populations as technologies advance. I think many of you know that technologies are advancing at a very quick speed. Before, everyone was talking about OpenAI and ChatGPT, but now, within no time, the Chinese have come up with DeepSeek, which is a much cheaper model. So again, while I'm not saying that these technologies, such as ChatGPT, are used in humanitarian context, I know for a fact that AI, the humanitarian sector is using large language models to help aid workers look for solutions in emergencies. They're training this. So it's only a matter of time before it goes into global south context. There are ethical concerns as technologies advance. So these are some of the quotes from aid workers I talked to who are concerned. For example, if AI is used in Africa, for example, how does one explain to a refugee that they were excluded by an algorithm? This may seem like science fiction, but it's already happening in Asia, where AI technologies are being used to verify documents of refugees. And in the US, there was a scandal where AI had wrongly translated languages of refugees, which could impact potentially asylum. One of the aid workers also explained that it is difficult to explain to refugees how they were excluded because we as aid workers also do not know what's going inside a machine. So this is why we should be careful when using AI technologies in humanitarian contexts. Another aid worker explained that a machine cannot look at a family and assess vulnerability because it relies on data. I can look at a family and know that they're at risk. So future research needs to unpack agreements between UN agencies and private actors to understand issues of data ownership and how the data is used. There's a research gap in respect to privacy concerns and legal liability inside humanitarian context, particularly who is accountable for harms in such contexts. Because if you outsource to private actors, we don't know what the agreements say. So do the private actors own the data? Can they use it to train other machines? And if they're coming up with AI technologies to improve assessments or humanitarian aid, we can only guess that they're using sensitive refugee data to do so. But at what risk or cost to refugees? We also need to understand the impact of private tech companies on governance. As private actors rapidly exercise authority in humanitarian sector, we should not just look at the negative side. We should look at how to harness the capacities of private actors in ways that benefit refugees beyond a mere aid washing. I would argue that what's happening is aid washing. On one hand, you come up with technologies that seemingly improve aid assistance, but indeed they're serving the stakeholders more than they are benefiting refugees. Ferguson says that behind the data is technology, such as algorithms, network analysis, data mining, machine learning, and a host of computer technologies, which we do not know, and which is being improved every day. So it is in this context that we should understand the humanitarian technologies. This might need including refugees in tech design. For example, in one of the refugee camps where I will be going to do research, many of the refugees that have come from Sudan are IT professionals. So it shouldn't be inconceivable that we could include IT technicians who are refugees to understand how their data can be used to benefit them the most. So the issue is looking at how refugees can be involved in the designing of humanitarian tech in ways that advance refugee protection goals. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.